Hi, my name is Clara Mitchell, and 3 months ago, I stared death in the face because of the woman who gave me life. I was lying in a hospital bed with tubes in my arms and an oxygen mask pressed tight against my face, fighting to breathe through lungs that felt like they were burning from the inside. The steady beep of the monitor above me was the only proof I was still tethered to this world. Then I felt a hand on the mask. For a second, I thought it was a nurse adjusting it, but then the hiss of oxygen stopped. The air disappeared and I saw her. My own mother Evelyn leaned close, her eyes sharp as glass, and whispered directly into my ear, "You're just a burden." The words sliced through me harder than the suffocating silence. She lifted the tube away her face, calm, almost serene, as if she were tidying a room rather than stealing the breath from her own daughter. Panic exploded inside me. I thrashed weakly, my body too frail from the asthma attack that had put me there. My chest screamed for air, and black spots began blooming across my vision like ink spreading through water. I clawed at the sheets, trying to sit up, trying to scream, but all that came out was a strangled gasp that sounded more like an animal than a person. The monitor above me shrieked as my oxygen level plummeted. Somewhere down the hall, alarms echoed. I thought, this is it. This is how it ends. Not from disease, not from accident, but from betrayal so close it could only come from blood. My lungs seized, every nerve begged for air, and my mother just stood there, eyes cold, lips thin. She leaned closer as if savoring it and repeated the words like a prayer. Just a burden. In that instant, the truth crystallized. I was not her daughter. I was her liability, her problem to erase. Then the door burst open. Two nurses and a doctor rushed in, shouting, their voices frantic. One shoved my mother back. Another slammed the oxygen back onto my face. A sharp rush of air filled my chest like fire returning to a dying candle. My body convulsed as I sucked in desperate gulps. I coughed so violently, I thought my ribs might crack, tears streaming uncontrollably down my face. The world lurched between darkness and harsh fluorescent light. I caught fragments of words, minutes from coding, keep pressure, stabilize. The doctor's voice cut through, firm and brutal. She was minutes from dying. I clung to that sentence because it was proof I wasn't crazy. I hadn't imagined it. I had been on the edge and she had pushed me closer. They strapped the mask tighter, needles bit my skin with emergency medication, and slowly the roaring silence receded into the pounding rhythm of survival. When the chaos calmed, I turned my head weakly. My mother was standing near the wall, arms folded, her face composed, as if none of it had happened. When the doctor demanded to know what she had done, she said with icy precision she pulled it off herself. She panicked. She always panics. Daniel, my older brother, appeared moments later, phone still in his hand, from whatever convenient call had kept him absent. He nodded along with her story without even looking at me. "She's unstable," he told the doctor like he was reading from a script. Their words folded over mine, smothering me even as I tried to protest. My throat rasped, but nothing came out except a broken whisper. Gaslighting, that's what it was. A lifetime of rewriting reality until I doubted the evidence of my own eyes. But not this time. I felt the mask digging into my face, felt the sting of air tearing through my lungs, felt the truth branding itself into my bones. I had been minutes from death, and my mother had been the one holding the mask. That night, as I lay under fluorescent lights, chest aching from the near suffocation, I promised myself this story would not end with me erased. They thought they had buried me under silence and shame, but I had survived. And survival is not the end. It is the beginning of reckoning. When the machines finally settled into their steady rhythm, and the staff left me alone with my own rattling breath, I stared up at the ceiling tiles and asked myself the question that burned hotter than the oxygen forcing itself into my lungs. When did my mother decide I was no longer worth saving? Was it tonight in the sterile glow of this hospital room? Or had it been long before, when she first branded me? Weak, dramatic, useless. I thought back to childhood dinners where silence was demanded, where Daniel's jokes earned applause, while my attempts at conversation were met with a quick, "Clara, enough." I remembered being 12, sitting on the porch with my inhaler clutched in my hand, crying from another attack while she stood over me, arms crossed, saying, "Stop exaggerating, you'll be fine." That was the script she had perfected, the one Daniel echoed now like gospel. Clara is unstable. Clara is dramatic. Clara is always panicking. The cruelty of tonight was not sudden. It was an accumulation, a verdict handed down over years of smaller suffocations. Each dismissal, each rolled eye, each sharp word had been another tug on the cord pulling me toward invisibility. But lying there, with the mask pressed to my face, and the memory of her voice whispering burden into my ear, I realized invisibility was exactly what they counted on. They assumed I would never speak loud enough to be believed, never gather proof, never risk their wrath. That was their mistake. I was 35 years old, educated, capable, no longer the trembling girl waiting for approval that would never come. Tonight, she had tried to erase me, and instead, she had carved her guilt into stone. The doctor's words, minutes from dying, looped in my head like a recording undeniable, irrefutable. I pictured my father long gone, the only one who ever looked at me with softness. He used to tell me, if the day ever comes when you doubt yourself, remember I never did. What would he think now, watching the woman he once loved try to strangle the life out of their daughter under the cover of a hospital visit? The anger that flickered in my chest was different from the wild panic of suffocation. It was steady, a coal rather than a flame. Anger could be harnessed. Anger could be sharpened. I turned my head to the side, saw my reflection faintly in the dark window glass. Pale, hollow-eyed tubes snaking across my body, but alive. And in that faint reflection, I whispered to myself, "You are not a burden. You are the evidence." Long before the hospital room and the hiss of stolen oxygen, there were smaller moments that built the foundation of this betrayal brick by brick, until the weight of them pressed against my chest as heavily as any asthma attack, and made me question whether I had ever truly been loved at all. My earliest memories are of Daniel being celebrated for every trivial achievement while I was criticized for every minor mistake. When he brought home a B on a math test, my mother baked a cake to encourage his effort. But when I brought home the same grade, she slapped the paper against the table and said, "Disappointment does not even begin to cover it." I remember the sting of her hand when I spilled milk at the age of 8, and the coldness in her eyes when she found me wheezing on the back steps during spring pollen season. She would say, "Stop exaggerating, Clara," and then lecture me about how I embarrassed the family by looking weak in front of neighbors. Daniel was encouraged to play sports while I was told to keep quiet and stay out of the way. Once at a family picnic, I tried to join the children chasing each other through sprinklers and ended up coughing violently, clutching my chest. Instead of concern, my mother hissed, "You always ruin things with your drama." My father was the only soft place in that storm. He would kneel beside me, rub my back, press the inhaler into my hand, and tell me quietly that my breath mattered. But he died too soon when I was 15, and after that, Evelyn's cruelty no longer had a counterweight. Daniel became her pride and joy, the golden son destined for success in business, while I was the quiet shadow useful only when she needed errands run or chores done. She never said "I love you" without attaching a correction. At 20, she refused to co-sign my college loan, but happily drained my small savings account to fund Daniel's first used car. At 23, she threw a glass of water in my face when I told her I wanted to move to the city and teach shouting that I would never survive on my own. When I tried to leave anyway, she withheld my medical records, making it harder to refill prescriptions, telling relatives I was unstable and needed supervision. The gaslighting became its own prison. Every time I doubted myself, she tightened her grip. She reminded me constantly that Daniel was successful while I was an expense. She would say with a saccharine smile, "You will thank me one day for protecting you from your own mistakes." Protecting meant locking me into financial traps. At 27, she coerced me into signing as a guarantor for one of Daniel's failed ventures, saying, "Family helps family." When the loan defaulted, she blamed me for not working hard enough to pay it back. The physical violence never truly stopped either. Once, when I came home late from work exhausted, she slapped me across the face so hard my lip split because she claimed I was lying about overtime. Another time, she grabbed my wrist and twisted until I dropped the inhaler I was holding, laughing as I scrambled to pick it up. Control was her drug, and Daniel was her accomplice, laughing at her cruelty, echoing her words, reinforcing the narrative that I was fragile, hysterical, incapable. At holidays, I was seated at the end of the table, expected to smile politely while they toasted his successes. When I tried to contribute to conversations, she would cut me off with the phrase, "Nobody asked you, Clara." The gaslighting reached its peak when I finally built a small life of my own as a teacher in a neighboring town. I paid my own rent, kept my own schedule, but she still found ways to intrude. She would show up at school events uninvited, whispering to colleagues that I had emotional problems, undermining me in front of those I worked with. Once she told my principal that I should not be trusted with field trips because of my asthma. Every attempt at independence was met with sabotage. And yet, foolishly, I kept returning to family gatherings, hoping for some flicker of approval, some tiny signal that she saw me as worthy. Instead, I was met with humiliation after humiliation. On my 30th birthday, she organized a dinner that she labeled a family celebration. But I was seated next to the restrooms while Daniel gave a toast about business achievements. When I asked if she had forgotten to bring out a cake, she smiled and said, "You are too old for that kind of attention." The message was clear. Daniel was the heir, the son to carry her name, and I was the mistake, the weight, the oxygen tank she would one day be tempted to unplug. I did not see it then as clearly as I do now. Back then, I thought maybe if I tried harder, worked longer hours, proved myself more capable, she might soften. Instead, she grew sharper, her cruelty evolving from insults into strategies. She controlled finances, spread rumors, manipulated relatives, and used every weakness against me. The climax of all those years was the hospital room, but the roots stretched decades deep. The night she whispered burden, I realized it was not a new script, but the final act of one she had been rehearsing my entire life. By the time I reached my mid-30s, the pattern of abuse had hardened into something almost mechanical. A routine of control that no one outside our family could see, but I lived with every day like a second skin. I had moved into a small apartment in a neighboring town, determined to build distance, but my mother's reach extended like a shadow. She insisted she would help with bills, then demanded access to my bank account, disguising it as concern for my financial discipline. When I resisted, she staged scenes of pity in front of relatives, telling them I was reckless and unfit to manage money. More than once, I discovered new credit cards opened in my name, debts piled onto me, while Daniel's ventures mysteriously stayed afloat. When I confronted her, she smiled in that chillingly calm way and said, "Family sacrifices, Clara, and you are the one with the least to lose." She controlled me through health too, arriving unannounced at my apartment with my medication, insisting she had picked it up by mistake and that I should keep it at her house for safety. Every refusal was twisted into proof of instability. At Thanksgiving, she told the entire table Clara imagines slights where there are none. She even thinks I hide her inhalers. Laughter followed Daniel chuckling loudest, and I sat there, with my hands clenched so tight my nails dug crescents into my palms. The humiliation was public and calculated, reminding everyone that my role was the fragile daughter, the unstable sister, the weak link. Control did not stop at words. She had no hesitation using physical intimidation even when I was an adult. One evening, when I confronted her about forged documents I had found in the mail, she slammed the door against my shoulder so hard the bruise lingered for weeks. Another time, she cornered me in my own kitchen, grabbing my wrist in the same way she had when I was a child, twisting until I nearly dropped the grocery bag I held, muttering, "You will never win against me." Daniel reinforced her every move, calling me hysterical when I tried to protest, mocking me on social media with posts that hinted at my supposed breakdowns. At a family reunion, he stood before cousins and neighbors and said with a grin, "Clara is always overdramatic. Probably will call the police if you sneeze too loud." They laughed, and in that laughter, I heard my isolation solidify. Each public humiliation was another chain around my neck. It was not enough that my mother controlled my finances and my health. She needed to own the narrative, to ensure that anyone who might one day believe me would already be poisoned by her words. Even in my professional life, the shadow followed me. Parents of my students would mention quietly that my mother had told them I struggled with episodes. My principal once asked gently if I needed a leave of absence because someone had called the school office claiming I was under psychiatric care. I knew the voice on the other end had been hers. The violence was not always a slap or a shove, though those came often enough. The real violence was the constant erosion of identity, the daily suffocation of gaslighting, the tightening noose of control. And yet, despite everything, I still found myself at her house. Whenever Daniel called a family meeting, still answering when she demanded my presence, still hoping some part of her would relent. The night in the hospital proved that hope was the most dangerous drug of all. She had escalated from slaps and twisted wrists from stolen money, and forged signatures to the ultimate violence, the theft of breath. She had shown her hand completely, and yet even then Daniel stood behind her, nodding, murmuring that I was unstable, planting seeds of doubt in the very doctors who had nearly lost me. That was the present reality of my life, before the turning point. Every breath I took was contested, every piece of independence sabotaged, every shred of dignity mocked, until I began to believe I truly was a burden. But that belief shattered, with the oxygen mask shattered, in the moment the doctor said I had been minutes from dying. In that instant, their control cracked, and I saw the cruelty for what it was: not protection, not discipline, but a calculated erasure. The night of the hospital incident was not an isolated storm, but the inevitable climax of years of escalating cruelty, and it replayed in my head with a clarity that kept me awake for weeks afterward, every detail etched like a scar. I had been rushed to the emergency ward after a severe asthma attack, struck me at work collapsing in the hallway, while students screamed for help. The paramedics told me later I was blue when they found me, and that if they had been delayed even 5 minutes, I would not have made it to the ambulance alive. The sterile room became my cage 4 lines, tethering me to survival machines, hissing with oxygen, that felt like fire forcing its way back into lungs, scarred from years of attacks. I drifted in and out of sleep, until I woke to find Evelyn seated beside me, hands folded neatly in her lap, her face a mask of maternal concern that I had learned long ago was only a costume. She smoothed my blanket and whispered that Daniel was handling things at home, that she would take care of me. I wanted to believe her, but something in her voice coiled like a snake, a softness too rehearsed. Hours passed in restless fog until I felt the mask shift against my skin. At first I thought it had slipped, but then I saw her hand steady and deliberate, pulling the oxygen away. My body reacted in primal terror, chest seizing fingers, clawing the air for something to hold. I tried to cry out, but all that came was a rasp, a wheeze, a strangled sound that would not carry. She leaned close enough that I smelled her perfume mixed with antiseptic, and said words that froze me harder than the suffocation itself. "You are just a burden." Her tone was not angry, but final, like a verdict already delivered. I felt darkness flood the edges of my vision, a suffocating tide swallowing me whole. The monitor screamed, nurses pounded down the hall. But in those endless seconds, all I knew was the betrayal of blood turned executioner. When the staff burst in and ripped the mask from her grip, forcing it back against my face, my lungs convulsed violently, each gasp a knife tearing me from the brink. I vomited bile tears, streaming, body convulsing, while Evelyn stepped back with infuriating composure. Daniel appeared in the doorway, phone in hand, his face unreadable, as if he had been waiting for the outcome before deciding his story. The doctor barked at them both, demanding to know what happened. Evelyn answered smoothly that I had panicked and pulled the mask off myself, and Daniel nodded, echoing her lies, telling them I was unstable. Their words wrapped around me like chains, attempting to bury the truth beneath a practiced script. I tried to shake my head to croak out denial, but my throat was raw, my voice swallowed by the hiss of oxygen. I heard the doctor say sharply, "She was minutes from dying," but I also saw the uncertainty in his eyes as my mother's lies slithered into the room. That was the betrayal at its peak, not only that she had tried to kill me, but that she had already prepared the alibi, already poisoned my credibility so thoroughly that even the evidence of my near death could be bent into another narrative of instability. Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder in silent solidarity, while I lay gasping, and in that tableau, I understood that my survival was an inconvenience to them both. I was supposed to fade quietly, erased as a liability, my absence explained away as tragedy, my assets folded neatly into their control. Instead, I was alive, barely clinging to consciousness with a fury that outlasted the suffocation. That fury told me this was not an accident or a moment of madness. It was premeditated, deliberate, the culmination of a campaign to erase me. My body might have been weak, but my mind was suddenly carved into steel. They had crossed the line from cruelty into attempted murder. And even if no one else believed me, I would not allow them to write the ending. After the hospital episode, the attempt to suffocate me was not spoken of in our family, except in twisted whispers that painted me as the architect of my own near death. And soon the gaslighting bled into public spaces until I felt the weight of humiliation, not just in sterile wards, but in the eyes of neighbors and acquaintances who believed their lies. My mother wasted no time crafting a narrative of instability, telling relatives that I had ripped the oxygen mask off in a hysterical panic, that doctors had warned her about my episodes. Daniel amplified the script on social media, posting vague messages like, "Pray for my sister Clara." She struggles with reality, accompanied by photos of himself kneeling piously at church. The comments flooded with sympathy for him, while I scrolled through in silent rage, watching strangers applaud his supposed devotion to a sister who was painted as unhinged. At Sunday service, my mother leaned in to whisper to the pastor that I needed prayers for mental strength, then later stood before the congregation with tears in her eyes, describing how hard it was to watch her daughter spiral. No one questioned her performance. Instead, women pressed my hands after the service, telling me gently that they hoped I would find peace while their eyes carried the pity reserved for the broken. The humiliation grew sharper when neighbors began avoiding me. Their conversations clipped, their glances edged with suspicion. One woman I had known since childhood told me softly that my mother had confided I sometimes confused dreams with reality, that my claims could not always be trusted. I wanted to scream that I had nearly died, that there were alarms and doctors and monitors shrieking proof of it, but the words stuck in my throat because I knew they had already chosen their side. Daniel used gatherings as stages for his mockery. At a cousin's wedding, he raised a glass and said with a smirk, "Let us toast to Clara's strength in battling her wild imagination." Laughter rippled through the room, some polite, some cruelly genuine, while I sat frozen in my chair, nails digging into my palms until they left bloodied crescents. Even colleagues felt the ripple. Parents of my students approached the principal after receiving anonymous phone calls warning them that I was emotionally unstable. I knew the voice had been my mother's, carefully modulated to sound like concern. The principal asked quietly if I needed a leave of absence. I swallowed my fury and told him I was fine, though inside I felt the noose tighten. This was the cruelty refined, not a slap across the face or a hand yanking my inhaler away, but the erasure of my credibility in the eyes of the world. If I dared speak the truth of what had happened in the hospital, I would be dismissed as delusional, another symptom of the instability they had scripted for me since childhood. That was the real violence, the systematic stripping away of belief, until even I began to question my memories. At night, I replayed the moment over and over, the mask torn away, the words burden, the choking blackness, and then I heard her voice in my head whispering, I had done it to myself. For a terrifying heartbeat, I almost believed it. Then I would force myself to remember the doctor's words minutes from dying and the sound of the alarm screaming. Those details anchored me to reality, proof that I was not insane. But humiliation has a way of seeping under the skin, of making every step in public feel like walking naked under hostile eyes. They wanted me erased not only from inheritance or home, but from the trust of the community, reduced to a shadow no one would defend. The betrayal had expanded beyond blood to the very people I had thought might help me, and it was in that suffocating loneliness that I realized silence was no longer an option. If I did not fight back, I would not just lose dignity, I would lose the right to truth itself. The shift began quietly, almost invisibly, like the first crack in a dam that no one notices until the flood surges through, and it started with a nurse named Maya, who had been on duty the night my oxygen was unplugged. Weeks later, when I returned to the hospital for a follow-up appointment, she found me in the corridor, glanced around nervously, and pressed a small flash drive into my palm. Her voice was low but steady as she said, "Check this when you are alone. You need it." That night, I locked my apartment door and sat at my kitchen table staring at the drive like it was a weapon, because in truth it was. When I finally opened the file, I saw grainy footage from the ICU camera, black and white, but unmistakable. My mother's hand reaching for the mask, pulling it free, her lips moving in words I could not hear but knew by heart. The footage did not last long before nurses stormed in, but it was enough irrefutable the truth captured on tape. My chest tightened, but this time not from fear, from relief. I was not crazy. I was not delusional. There was proof. Maya had risked her career to give it to me, and in that act, she became the first ally I had in years. Soon after, another ally emerged in the form of Mr. Howard, a retired police officer who lived across the street from my mother. One evening, as I stepped out of my car, he waved me over with urgency. His voice was gravelly but kind when he told me he had seen my mother leaving the hospital that night. Just as the alarms blared, her expression strangely calm, and that he had never been able to shake the feeling she had done something. He offered to put it in writing if I ever needed. His words felt like water in a desert, confirmation from outside the poisoned circle of family that what I remembered was real. But the most powerful piece came from the past, from an email I stumbled across while sorting through old files my father had left on a hard drive. The subject line read, "In case you need this," and it was dated 2 years before his death. In it, he warned that Evelyn had been manipulating documents for years, moving property into Daniel's name, and he feared she might one day target me directly. He urged me to keep careful records and to never trust verbal promises. His final line made my throat ache. "Clara, if you are reading this because something happened, fight. I raised you stronger than she thinks." With Maya's video, Howard's testimony, and my father's prescient email, the war chest began to take shape. I bought a locked box and began filling it with every scrap of evidence I could gather. Bank statements showing accounts drained into Daniel's businesses, photocopies of loan documents, with signatures that only resembled mine, screenshots of Daniel's mocking posts, even a church bulletin, where my mother had praised her son's success while referring to me only as our fragile one. Each page was another bullet in the arsenal I was building. For the first time, I did not feel powerless. The humiliation still burned, the whispers still followed me, but beneath the shame, a new current ran steady and cold. Purpose. I realized that silence had been their greatest weapon, but evidence was mine. I stopped shrinking in public. I recorded conversations, saved voicemails, cataloged every slip of the mask they allowed themselves in private. The final push came from Maya again, who told me quietly that a malpractice attorney she knew handled cases of abuse inside hospitals and would likely connect me to the right legal help. I contacted her, a sharp woman named Angela Ruiz, and within minutes of hearing my story and seeing the footage, she said, "Clara, this is not just family cruelty. This is attempted murder." Hearing those words spoken aloud by someone with authority was like oxygen itself. Angela explained we could pursue both criminal and civil paths, that the law might finally cut through the web of lies that had suffocated me my entire life. She warned it would be ugly, that my mother and Daniel would fight viciously, but her eyes glinted with certainty when she said, "They slipped. You have proof. We will make it undeniable." For the first time, I looked toward the future and saw not just survival, but justice. The turning point had arrived, the dam had cracked, and soon the flood would come. The day of the hearing arrived with a stillness that felt unnatural, as if the air itself was holding its breath. And when I stepped through the courthouse doors with Angela at my side, the echoes of my heels on the tile floor sounded louder than they should have, a metronome counting down to judgment. My mother sat near the front, her posture ramrod straight, dressed in a pale blue suit that made her look more like a church matron than the woman who had pulled the air from my lungs. Daniel was beside her, checking his phone with practiced indifference. And when his eyes met mine, there was no shame, only disdain, as if I had inconvenienced him by surviving. The courtroom filled with relatives, neighbors, even members of our church who wanted to see the spectacle, their whispers buzzing like flies. Cameras lined the back wall because Angela had tipped off a local reporter, knowing that public scrutiny would keep the defense from burying me in silence again. When the judge entered, a severe man with a voice like iron, the room stilled and the case was called. The opposing attorney painted a picture of a fragile woman prone to hallucinations, claiming I had panicked in the hospital, and invented accusations out of hysteria, his tone dripping with condescension as he gestured toward my mother, with words like devoted caretaker. My heart pounded, but Angela's eyes burned steady, and when she rose she said with unshakable calm, "Your Honor, this is not hysteria. This is attempted murder, and we have proof." She loaded the ICU footage onto the screen. The room darkened. The grainy image flickered to life, and there it was, undeniable. Evelyn's hand pulling the mask from my face, her lips moving in silent cruelty. A gasp broke from the gallery. Someone whispered, "Oh my God," and I felt every eye swing toward my mother, who sat frozen, her hands tightening on her lap until her knuckles whitened. Angela followed with Mr. Howard's testimony, his clear recounting of seeing her leaving the hospital, just as alarms blared, his voice carrying the authority of a retired officer. Then she produced my father's email, his words predicting her manipulations, urging me to fight. The defense sputtered, claiming the footage was unclear, that my father had been paranoid, but their arguments cracked under the weight of evidence. I rose when Angela nodded and walked to the stand. My voice trembled at first, but then steadied as I described the suffocation the words burdened, the darkness closing in, the way Daniel had stood by without lifting a finger. Every sentence was a blade cutting through years of gaslighting, reclaiming truth they had stolen. When the defense cross-examined, sneering that I was dramatic, I leaned forward and said firmly, "I was minutes from dying. That is not drama. That is fact." The judge's eyes narrowed, and the jury leaned in. Then something unexpected happened. Evelyn herself erupted, slamming her hand on the table and shouting, "She was always weak, always dragging us down." I did what had to be done. Gasps rippled again. Daniel hissed for her to stop, but the words hung in the air like poison, undeniable, the mask torn away. Angela seized the moment, her voice like a hammer. "Ladies and gentlemen, those are not the words of a caretaker. Those are the words of someone who sees her own daughter as disposable." The silence that followed was heavy, final, the kind of silence that signals the scales have tipped. After closing arguments, the judge dismissed the jury, and hours later they returned with a verdict that landed like thunder: guilty of attempted murder, guilty of financial fraud. Daniel, too, was implicated for his role in falsifying documents, guilty of fraud and conspiracy. The judge's words cut sharp, sentencing Evelyn to 15 years in prison, ordering restitution from Daniel. The reporters erupted with questions as the bailiff led them away. Microphones thrust forward, flashes popping. I stood steady, the verdict, a weight lifting from my chest. For the first time in decades, I was not invisible. Not the fragile daughter erased at the edge of photos, but the woman who had faced her abusers in the light and won. My mother's face twisted in rage as she was led out. Daniel cursed under his breath, and in that moment, I knew their reign of control was over. The courtroom that had once been a stage for their lies had become the place of their unmasking, and justice had finally, brutally, unmistakably arrived. In the weeks that followed the verdict, the consequences unfolded with a clarity sharper than any revenge I could have orchestrated alone, because justice itself had become the weapon, and the exposure was public, relentless, and undeniable. My mother was transferred to a state facility, her mugshot appearing on local news broadcasts alongside the headline, "Ohio woman convicted of attempted murder of her daughter." Neighbors who once whispered that I was unstable now crossed the street to avoid the shame of their complicity, and some knocked on my door stammering apologies. I accepted with cold politeness, but never with warmth. Daniel's downfall came swiftly and brutally as investigators uncovered the forged loans and fraudulent transfers he had built on my back. Creditors swarmed his businesses, lawsuits piled up, and within months he filed for bankruptcy, his once polished image as a rising entrepreneur reduced to tabloid fodder. He moved out of state under a cloud of disgrace, his social media pages silent after years of mocking me publicly. At church, the whispers changed tone, pity shifting into horror, as parishioners realized they had applauded my tormentors. The pastor delivered a sermon on the danger of false appearances, his words aimed at the pew where my mother once sat, and for the first time in years, I felt the weight of suspicion lift from my shoulders. Reporters asked for interviews, and though I refused most, I agreed to one with a local station because I wanted the truth on record. Sitting under bright studio lights, I told the story plainly, not with theatrics, but with the steady voice of someone who had survived. I described the night in the hospital, the years of gaslighting, the attempt to erase me, and the evidence that had saved me. The segment aired with the title, Family Betrayal in Plain Sight, and it spread quickly online, drawing thousands of comments from strangers who saw in my story echoes of their own hidden abuse. That was the revenge, sharper than any scream to know that the lies that once painted me unstable had been replaced with the undeniable image of my mother's hand pulling away my breath. Financial restitution from Daniel allowed me to reclaim my father's house, a place my mother had nearly stolen from me years before, and I renovated it room by room until the walls no longer carried her shadow. The living room became a meeting space where I began hosting small support groups for survivors of family abuse, women and men who had been gaslit into silence, but found strength in sharing their stories. Each week, the circle grew larger, and with each testimony, I felt my own wounds close a little more. My revenge was not fire or fury, but exposure and rebuilding, turning the narrative outward so that what had been used to isolate me now became a beacon for others. One evening, as I watered the small garden out front, Mr. Howard stopped by leaning on his cane and said simply, "You did it, kid. You pulled the mask off for everyone to see." His words carried the validation I had craved for decades, not from my mother or brother, but from truth itself. In every headline, in every court record, in every neighbor's averted eyes, the consequences burned permanent. My mother sat in a cell branded not as a martyr, but as an abuser. Daniel rotted under debt and disgrace, and I stood free. That was the public revenge, not the satisfaction of watching them suffer, but the permanence of their unmasking the certainty that they could never rewrite me into silence again. 3 months after the sentencing, I stood on the porch of my father's house, breathing air that finally felt like my own. And for the first time in years, the silence around me was not suffocating, but peaceful. The walls no longer carried my mother's perfume or Daniel's mocking laughter. Instead, they echoed with the sound of voices from the support groups I had begun hosting, survivors who came trembling and left stronger because they saw they were not alone. I transformed one of the back rooms into a consultation space with shelves of pamphlets about domestic violence, gaslighting, and financial abuse. And each week I sat across from people who looked at me with the same haunted eyes I once saw in the mirror. Healing was not instant, but it was steady, brick by brick, moment by moment, like repainting the house until every trace of rot was sealed away. I hung a single framed photo in the hallway. My father and I fishing at the lake, his arm slung around my shoulder, our smiles untainted by cruelty. And beneath it, I placed a small plaque that read, "Some roots grow deeper after the storm." Every time I passed it, I remembered his words from the old email urging me to fight, and I whispered back, I did. The message I carried for others was simple, but unshakable. Family is not defined by blood. It is defined by who holds your hand. When you cannot breathe, who protects your life instead of stealing it. My mother had tried to convince the world I was a burden, but survival turned me into evidence, and evidence became strength. Neighbors eventually stopped avoiding me, and some joined the groups confessing how easily they had believed lies because it was more comfortable than facing truth. I did not hate them. I simply refused to let their pity or betrayal define me. Daniel remained a ghost, his absence louder than his presence once was, and I no longer wasted energy wondering if he regretted anything. His downfall was his own to carry. What mattered was the garden I planted in the backyard rows of lavender and rosemary that thrived with little effort resilient herbs my father had once favored. On quiet evenings, I sat among them, with a cup of tea, the scent rising around me, and I felt the weight of years lift like smoke from a doused fire. Healing was not pretending nothing had happened. It was acknowledging that it had and choosing to live anyway. To anyone listening, I would say this if your family calls you a burden. Remember that survival itself is proof of worth. If they try to erase you, gather your evidence, speak your truth, and never let their silence suffocate you. Some wounds will never close, but they do not have to define the rest of your story. My mother sits in prison, my brother hides in disgrace, and I walk free with breath in my lungs and purpose in my hands. That is justice, that is healing, and that is the moral I leave with you.